breaking open what has come to be known traditionally as the triumphal entry. Grace, I think, will give us some background in a moment when I think she'll suggest that Matthew doesn't make it quite as triumphal as we like to think it is. I just want to say that Anne's standing in at short notice for Ellen Clark King in England, who has been bitten with the COVID bug. So thank you, Anne, for standing in from New South Wales. Bishop Steve across the harbour in Dunedin, and Grace from Chicago. Lovely to have you on board once again. And have you got some background for us?
I do. I actually want to look briefly at the history of the kind of triumphal entry that we see in other biblical texts. The imagery of Palm Sunday with the crowds and the palm branches is very, very, well known at this point, but it appears two other places in Scripture. The first is in Leviticus, which is describing how the Festival of Booths ought to be celebrated. There's descriptions of cutting palm fronds and the same sort of thing we see. Now, Palm Sunday does not occur at the same time as the Festival of Booths. However, in 2 Maccabees, there is a description of a celebration that takes place 1 year after the liberation of the temple, wherein the people do a Festival of Booths type celebration. This also did not happen at the time of the festival, but they do it. They pull out the palm fronds in memory of when, before they were liberated, they had to celebrate the Festival of Booths in secrecy, in the wilderness, and in caves. And so they sort of appropriate this palm frond celebration as a way to now commemorate the freedom and liberation of the temple. So you can start to see why that same sort of imagery might have been used by the people who are welcoming Jesus coming into the city. It really cements the sorts of expectations people had for Jesus, and it creates a context with other histories of liberation and oppression that had already been occurring in Jerusalem.
It is sounding a long way away from happy little family gatherings outside a church waving palms around. So we'll come back to you in a few minutes, Grace, because I'd like to hear some challenge around that. But let's go to you, Steve. And where do you find challenge in this Matthew version of the entrance?
Well, I thought I had enough challenge just reading it from Matthew, and now I'm including Maccabees and Leviticus. The whole of Palm Sunday seems to be a bit of a challenge. I guess for me, it's the challenge is looking at what is a unique person in Jesus Christ and a unique event coming in to achieve the pivotal moment for our salvation history. And so how is that applicable to me today, personally in New Zealand, Grace in Chicago, and in Australia? How is that relevant to me today, to take the journey of Jesus with his fickle crowd and his fickle disciples and seeing how that impacts on my life as a Christian today?
Thank you for that. And Anne, challenge.
Well, Matthew seems to make it pretty clear that Jesus is coming in as a king, the quote that he uses. And I think many of us find that king idea challenging. There's this fashion of talking about the kingdom, the KINDOM, instead of the kingdom. And that, we're talking about a commonwealth instead of a kingdom. Of course, Grace, we've got you from America here, so, not necessarily pro-king. And so I guess the challenge is why? I know it's a complex thing, why we're kind of rebelling slightly about that. Possibly it's how do we understand the kingdom and how do we understand the kingship of Jesus? And possibly thinking fatherhood of God can be a problem for people, until we think, well, we're supposed to learn what the fatherhood of God is from what the Son said about the Father, not about our own experience of fathers. And so presumably it's the same thing here. Rather than trying to transpose earthly kings onto God, it's saying, so what are we hearing and learning about the kingship of God here, riding in on a donkey, fighting for justice in the temple, washing feet. So yeah, it's a challenge is working out what to do with this concept of king.
I want to say this a little bit like the Mark messianic secret, and I don't want to dig into that because that's not my job, but Mark doesn't want us to get the whole victory of Jesus until the depth, the reach of God in the crucifixion has been revealed. And I wonder if Matthew is also doing something a bit like that. But it's not really my turn. I've just grabbed it anyway. Grace, it's your turn to offer some challenge.
Absolutely. My challenge this week is not an intellectual conundrum. It's not a scriptural puzzle. It's contemplative. This scene, when you know how Holy Week ends, reads very much like something out of Greek tragedy. And my challenge is for us to sit with that. What does it mean to be loved, knowing that that love will soon go sour? What does it mean to sit with joy and grief all in the same place and to try to love in the midst of that? Just sit with it.
Well, thank you, because that is challenging. It's deeply challenging. It's visceral. It goes right into the heart of our relationship with God and with one another and with God's world. Let's be now looking for some good news and taking these challenges, but finding the goodness, the good news.
Well, I'm actually going to use the king idea as good news as well as a bit of a challenge. King in sense of more in control than perhaps we know. I mean, I love this little bit at the beginning of this story about Jesus saying to the disciples, go and you'll find this donkey and it's going to be tied up. And if anyone asks, you say the Lord needs it, whatever, because you feel the disciples must have developed such a high tolerance level for bewilderment. Because how would Jesus have known about this donkey and how would he have known that someone was going to challenge them? And yet they do it because at least at this point they've learnt that there is more going on than they understand and that Jesus probably does understand it. And so I find that good news because it's reassuring that God's in control.
So there's a deep sense of trust there, as well as what grace has offered us. Steve, good news.
I guess it's good news to me that Jesus said yes to God and went in and took up this challenge, however much he understood it in his kenotic, emptied state, I don't know, but he knew enough of God to say yes. And the other bit of good news is that there are people like these unknown disciples that simply responded to, the Lord needs it. So yes, you can have it. And so I take that as challenge as well. How much is the Lord saying to me, I need this, Steve? And how much am I prepared to say, okay, you can have it? And how much am I trying to grasp and hold on to? So the good news is there are those unnamed people who said yes to Jesus. And that then becomes a challenge to me. What am I prepared to give up? Donkey and foal I don't have. There are things I can give up.
Just as a word of explanation, the kenotic, for those listening, the self-emptying of godness from Jesus in the incarnation. Lovely word, this kenosis. So, Grace, for you now, you need to take us into a place of good news.
I can. And my good news comes from that contemplation of grief and joy together, because on its own, that can be a very discouraging thing to contemplate. But the good news is that Christ comes anyways, even knowing that it will all go wrong, and it always will, it always does. Christ comes, apparently without second guessing or bitterness. Christ shows up.
The Christ who comes. So what? So what for us though? And so it's not ethereal, because I don't think it is. I think we're touching on some quite deep personal responses to this scene. But Steve, for you, where does the rubber hit the road in this passage?
I think for me it is the constancy of Jesus and his faithfulness compared with the fickleness of disciples and crowd. And however much I think that I'm making a difference in the church, actually it all relies on Jesus and what Jesus did. And I can see fickleness in myself. And so the so what for me is, how much am I prepared to let Jesus be Jesus in my life and in the life of the church?
And for you?
My so what is remembering the times that most of us will have experienced where we've had a real kind of spiritual high, wonderful experience of God, and we feel as if we're all out in our Christian lives, and then we flop and we fail, or we feel God's let us down. And the so what is the kind of continuation of the story. We read later of Jesus forgiving the disciples, and I'm sure Jesus would have forgiven any of these enthusiastic people who were waving and yelling Hosanna one day and yelling crucify the next. The story continues, and when we get to the point when we realize that there's more going on than we understood, and come back to God, then the forgiveness is there. So I know I'm kind of taking the story a bit beyond these few verses, but for me, that's the so what.
And interestingly, you've got echoes there, I think, and we all possibly have, don't know about Grace in Chicago, but of that Samuel Crossman hymn, and then crucify was all their breath.
Yeah.
Knowing that that's our breath too. We're very much prone to that fickle cry, and yet receiving that unwarranted forgiveness. Grace, I gather you've just submitted your thesis, by the way. Congratulations on that.
Thank
and
you.
from an energized theological student from Chicago, a final word as to application, as to so what?
Absolutely. For me, the so what hinges on the gap between the liberation that the people expected and the liberation that Christ brought. Anne mentioned the sort of kingly language and the people treating him as a coming king or a conquering Maccabee, but the liberation he brought would not be either of those. And of course, it's easy for us to look back in retrospect, but that's harder to do when we look at the freedom that we are fighting for in whatever circumstances we face today. And so I think Palm Sunday is always a good time to interrogate what kind of salvation we expect Christ to provide for us, and then sit with maybe the kind of salvation that Christ brings instead. It's rarely what we want.
The Christ
Wonderful,
who
Grace.
breaks out of our boxes again and again. Grace, thank you for that insight. Bishop Steve, and thank you very much for this famous scene from the New Testament, for breaking it open for yet another year.